Sadie Olsen turned around the problem discovery that she and her family were gluten intolerant when, on their many trips abroad, they discovered cassava flour. Searching the world for the best product available, they've come up with a fantastic product that she says make the best gluten-free tortillas ever. Here's her story.
Good morning, Sadie, and welcome to the Low Carb Paleo Show.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Mark, how are you today?
I'm wonderful, thank you, and I trust you are both wonderfully well as well.
I am, thank you.
Super.
I am doing my best. So Sadie, you and I met at the 2016 Paleo FX in Austin, and you own Otto's Natural, a company that produces a tasty cassava flour. I was so impressed by the quality of your products that I wanted to invite you to our show. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me so much.
It's our pleasure. So let's start with what is your story and how did you become interested in cassava flour?
You know, we were aware that my husband and I, John, we were aware that we were intolerant to grains for years, probably 10 years before the cassava flour even entered our minds. But we weren't super strict about it. Like, it would ebb and flow how strict we were, just depending on what country we were living in at the time, what was going on. But when I became pregnant with Otto, who is the namesake of the company, I became much more involved in my health and much more cognizant of what I was putting into my body, and much more strict about my dietary restrictions. And of course, along with pregnancy comes some ridiculously strong cravings, and I wanted some very specific things, and I had a really hard time replicating them with no grains. I tried really, really hard to love coconut flour, but it's terrible stuff. You know, unless you really love the taste of coconut in everything, which I don't. So I went out on a search for an alternative and searched high and low for just anything different, visited a lot of ethnic stores. Thankfully, I was living in an area at the time that had a lot of options. Went to Indian health food stores, went to African, went to Spanish, went all over the place trying every single flour I could get my hands on. And eventually came across a cassava flour that was made in Africa, actually. And I was really impressed by it. It had some drawbacks, but it was baking up really well most of the time. And I really was liking it. It had a very strong taste and smell, though, because their cassava flour is fermented. We can get into that a little bit more later. But anyway, it led me to search for something along those lines, but processed differently so that it wouldn't have the sour smell and taste that we were experiencing. And so was born both Ottos eventually.
Yeah. So where is that sour taste coming from?
It's the fermentation. So in Africa and usually sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied a little bit. In the traditional process of making cassava flour, they hand peel it and then they sun dry it for 3 to 5 days usually. So you can imagine, that moist environment for a couple of days, fermentation happens. And that's actually a really good thing. It's not a bad thing. It allows them to naturally break down the cyanide compounds that naturally occur in cassava. So for, countries without big ovens and without a lot of resources, it's actually pretty genius way to process it. But fermentation adds a really strong flavor that they are used to in their culture, and they actually enjoy it, and that's awesome. But for our Western palates, we don't want that sour, kind of musty occasionally flavor in our baked goods like muffins and cakes and cookies, the lighter things like that. It just doesn't appeal to our palate. And so that was why we looked for something that was processed differently and skipped that whole part of the process. Especially also because if you imagine 3 to 5 days of a moist environment is a really awesome environment for mold growth as well. So that was also a big drawback, especially being pregnant. I didn't want to expose my system to the chance of mold.
Right. So they ferment these roots, and we'll need to explain that too, the same way as they do for like coffee and cocoa as well. Cocoa, natural cocoa beans. So to go back a little bit, what is cassava? I do know it's a root, but can you explain more? What is it?
That's actually a really great way to describe it. It's a tuberous root vegetable. Exactly. It's a real, if you might have seen it in the grocery store, it's real ugly. It's these really big, long, brown roots. And oftentimes all the time in this country, they're coated with a shiny, waxy coating as a preservative to help them, because the roots don't stay fresh, but a very few days without that coating, and they have to schlep them over from, overseas. They don't grow here domestically.
Yeah, schlep, that's a very
technical term.
And what's another name for cassava? Because if you're not, I happen to be born in Africa, so I kind of know about the name, but what is another name for it in this country?
A lot of Spanish-speaking people call it yuca, Y-U-C-A, not to be confused with yucca, which is 2 C's and part of the cactus family.
Okay. So how did you go around this fermentation process and flavor to make it more palatable for us?
It's actually baked instead of sun-dried. So that's how we do it. So it's processed within 36 hours of harvest. So it's really nice, fresh fruits. And then it goes through a heat process. So it comes to you fully cooked, ready to eat, completely safe, and free of that fermentation step.
Okay, so unlike wheat, the root is actually baked before it's made into flour, is that right?
Exactly.
And that doesn't affect at all the further baking later on?
No, it actually is better for it. We are able to get the humidity levels just right for a flour to bake with. So it helps it. Also, some flours are dehydrated in other countries instead of the baking process or instead of the fermentation process. And those bags will sometimes even come with a warning label on them: do not consume before cooking. And so we skip all of that danger here. So even some people are putting flour in like their recovery drinks after they're working out, and they wouldn't be able to do that if we didn't cook it beforehand.
Now, you used a word earlier that will probably strike fear in most people, cyanide. Can you explain how that is taken out of the final product?
Sure. Well, first of all, there are 2 different kinds of cassava or yuca root. They're known as a sweet variety and a bitter variety. And the bitter variety has exponentially more cyanogenic compounds than the sweet variety does. So we start with the sweet variety only, much lower amount to start with. And then most of it lives right in that brown, ugly outer skin peel of it. And so that's completely removed before we ever start. So that's like the first step. And then there's a little bit that exists right in the sub layer right below that skin. And so any residual cyanogenic compounds are destroyed in the heating process. So that baking step that we have breaks that down. And every batch is lab tested to make sure that it's well below the acceptable limits of safety.
Okay. So my understanding is your product is gluten-free and paleo. Is that right?
Absolutely. So yuca is naturally gluten-free. It's processed in gluten-free facilities, so we don't have any risk of cross-contamination. And it's also naturally paleo-friendly. So we're actually even certified through the Paleo Foundation.
Now, I know both are roots, but what's the difference between cassava flour and tapioca?
That's a great question. One we get all the time. So tapioca is really the extracted starch of the yuca or the cassava root, whereas cassava flour is everything but the peel. So it has all the natural fiber still included. And that's really the difference between a starch and a flour. One has fiber, one doesn't have fiber. So tapioca is really more akin to like a cornstarch. As opposed to like the cornmeal. Like you couldn't bake cornbread using just cornstarch instead of cornmeal. And the same is true with tapioca. You can't bake a recipe with tapioca that calls for cassava flour, all-purpose flour. You just get a massive gummy mess.
Right.
Another technical.
Yeah, another technical. So what products can you make with cassava flour? The same as you would with wheat, pretty much?
Pretty much. There are a lot of recipes that you don't need additional flours for, that you can just use cassava flour in. The easiest ones are cakes and pancakes, crepes. You can make a roux with it very easily, just like you would wheat flour. You can make almost anything. We do find that in recipes that require yeast, that it's not a one-to-one sub, but we do have recipes available that have been optimized for cassava flour, available for anyone.
Okay. We'll talk about that too. Where do you get your cassava from? Is it from Africa or is it from Latin America?
Brazil. Ours
Brazil.
is exclusively from Brazil, yeah.
In Brazil. And what makes their cassava products better than the one coming from other country, for example?
I really think it comes down to just expertise. Like they have experience processing it in ways that the plants in Africa just don't. They're usually doing it in the sun dried and the fermented way, and they've got lots of experience in Africa doing it that way. But Brazil just, they have like 13 different cassava flours on the market, all like slightly different from each other. They have a lot of experience in doing it different ways and coming at it from different directions.
Going back to recipes, do you have a cookbook or a book available using cassava flour, or all the recipes on the website?
I don't have a cookbook. I've been wanting to do an ebook of like best of Instagram and compiling a lot of those recipes, but it takes a lot of time to get permissions for reprinting and things like that. So I'm working on that. But in the meantime, there are a couple of bloggers that have put cookbooks out. Zen Belly and Predominantly Paleo have both put a couple of cookbooks out that use cassava flour quite a bit. There's Paleo Soups and Stews. There's the new Yiddish cookbook, which has a really popular bagel recipe in it that's phenomenal. There's also a brand new one out called Paleo Cooking with Your Instant Pot or something like that. That's super, super popular and people are loving. So there are resources out there. We do have a handful of recipes on our website, and there are something like 500 recipes available on our Pinterest page for people to resource, where we've kind of compiled everybody's recipes that have published on the web and tried to get those all together for people.
Nice. And what is the name of your website again?
ottosnaturals.com. OTTOSNATURALS.com.
Great. Can you tell us about the good news about Whole Foods Market?
Yes. We're launching nationally with Whole Foods in March, which we're super, super excited about.
Wow. That's a big step. Are you ready for it? Like extra volume and...
My stress level has increased exponentially. Yeah, I think we are. I think we are ready for it. It's going to double our store amount that we're in. I think we're in maybe 350, 400 stores around the country at the moment, and that will increase in March by 425. So it's a big deal. And also, we're going into HEB in Texas, which you're familiar with. We're going into 100 HEB stores in May as well.
Cool. Also, will you be back at Paleo FX this year?
Absolutely. We love Paleo FX.
I'll see you there.
Excellent. Thank you.
Speaking of diets, what is your current diet now? What are you still sensitive to grain? Do you cook or do you bake only with cassava? Do you use other flours?
We have a few recipes that add in a little bit of extra flours here and there, like the pizza recipe that we did along with Plank's Love and Guacamole. There's like a few tablespoons of arrowroot flour in there and 1 tablespoon of my beloved coconut flour, which I tried to work out but couldn't. Sometimes it's needed. And that is a great recipe. And so we do use some other flours in that one, but primarily, we use cassava flour in everything. Otto actually, I think, thinks that all flour is cassava flour. I'm not sure he's even aware that there's other flours out there.
Right.
Our current diet is grain-free. I have not been able to get over our intolerances to grain. In fact, I'm one of the unlucky ones that can't even do rice. I know a lot of people on paleo do rice as well, but rice is actually harder on my system than wheat is for some reason. Mm-hmm. So we're pretty restricted. Although interestingly, we can go to Italy and have pasta there without reaction, but I can't touch it stateside.
Yeah. I have the same issue when I go back to France. I have no problem whatsoever with gluten sensitivity. When I come back here, then I get rashes if I eat breads, in this country, or bread products. So going back to the flavor, because it's intriguing to me. When you compare to other flours, is there a noticeable flavor difference, let's say, compared to wheat, compared to coconut or other gluten-free flours?
There's a huge difference next to coconut flour for sure, because coconut has such a strong flavor to it. There is some difference definitely between an all-purpose flour and cassava flour, although it's not, it's certainly not as big of a difference. Cassava has its own flavor for sure, but I've heard people describe it as like the flavor strength of a white potato. Like it has its own flavor, but you put enough butter on it and you're really just tasting the butter. It's kind of a vehicle, right? Okay. And so that's how cassava flour is it's neutral enough. We're like we have a tortilla recipe on the back of our bag that is cassava flour, water, salt, and 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And it's a mild enough flavor that if you're not using a good quality olive oil, you're going to taste the olive oil. You're not going to taste the cassava flour. So we really encourage people to make sure that they use an olive oil where they enjoy the flavor of it. Otherwise. Right.
And so of all these recipes, which one is your current favorite recipe?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think the ones that are in the biggest rotation around our house are the tortillas for sure, because they're just so fast and easy and simple. The French bread recipe on our website, we make quite a bit, both in baguette and in loaf form. And the pizza recipe we make for parties a lot, and the chocolate chip cookie recipe those are our biggest rotations. We bring those to a lot of parties so we can have a sweet treat.
Right. And so your friends, when you bring pizza or cookies, do they know? Can they tell the difference? Do you even tell them?
I do tell them, because we have a lot of gluten-free friends too, so they always want to know if it's safe for them to eat or it's not. And so all of our friends know that it's cassava flour that we're making. But it all disappears, so it seems like they like it.
Just a quick question, really. Obviously, it's being gluten-free. That's a brilliant bonus for anybody who is gluten sensitive. Are there any other health benefits to cassava flour, or using cassava full stop?
Anecdotally, we hear a lot from diabetics that are saying that even though the carb content is high, just as high as like an all-purpose flour, they don't see blood sugar spikes. So that is really interesting. And we're looking into why that might be. Maybe there's some resistant starch in it. We're not sure. It's been a little bit tough to get lab tests to verify that. But that has been a big bonus for a lot of people, is that it's not negatively affecting their blood sugar as you would expect something would do with the carb content that it has.
Excellent. I'm going to just tread on Alain's toes a minute here and sort of ask about the chemical interaction that the farmers might use. Are you sure that the cassava that you get is naturally produced? There's no pesticides or that sort of thing on it?
That's a really tough question. We are non-GMO project verified, so we start there. And then the real deal is that our supplier purchases from all the local independent farmers that surround the facility. Cassava is not a widely sprayed food to start with, which is in our favor. It's also really drought resistant, so chemical fertilizers are not generally used because they're not necessary. And it's actually been noted, I've got some references that show that pesticides are not, they're not cost effective to use on yuca anyways, because the two main blights that affect cassava don't respond to chemicals. That's not to say that somebody isn't buying into some salesman that comes by and says, hey, try this. So while we don't have third-party verification to ensure that none of the small farmers that we're purchasing from ever use it, we do test the flour once a year to see what's going on with it. And so far, 2 years in, there have been no quantifiable levels of pesticide detected in the flour.
I have another question, if I may. Fiber-wise, is for people that have sensitive digestive system like IBS and Crohn's disease and inflammation, does the fiber affect them, or is it, do they digest it well?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure that I have the answer to it. I haven't received any specific feedback from people with those things. I know that some people have said that they need to stay away from things with high starch content in it, that tend to not digest cassava flour well because it does have a high starch content in it. I haven't specifically heard about the fiber aspect though, so I'm sorry I don't have an answer to that.
Okay.
Obviously, it's available in more and more places in the States, and I guess that filters over into Canada as well, somewhat.
There's a company called Flour Confections that carries it and ships nationwide in Canada. So they've been super helpful for us to work with.
Excellent. What about Europe? Have you come over to Europe yet?
So there is a brand new person looking, feeling their way through Sweden to see if there is some long-term interest there. There is also distributors in both Australia and New Zealand carrying it.
Oh, that's good.
Hopefully we'll be in UK soon, but it's there have been several people interested and nobody that's actually bitten yet.
Yes, it's quite an undertaking, isn't it, to sort of take on a new territory. So I understand that. Aside the flour, are there any other products that you're going to get into?
There are a few things that are coming down the pike that we're in R&D with right now. Nothing that I can that we're close enough to announce yet, but hopefully there will be some exciting things this year. Okay.
I mean, just as an overall thing, is that going to be finished products or is that going to be ingredient type products?
Both.
Both. Excellent. So there's lots to look out for.
Yeah.
So we have to keep our eyes peeled on your website.
Yeah, it's a big secret, so we'll have to invite you back. Huh?
There you go.
Super job. Well, can you remind us of your website once again, please?
Sure. ottosnaturals.com. OTTOSNATURALS.com.
And that is Cassava Flour Central, I take it, for everything, for recipes, for
the recipes. We're a little bit understaffed at the moment, so we don't have copious amounts of recipes on there. But please follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Instagram is by far where most of the recipes appear. So we'll repost from other bloggers, and then again, Pinterest is where they live.
Thank you again, Sadie, for being on the Low Carb Paleo Show. And as we say in Texas, à votre santé, yo.
Thank you so much, both of you. I really appreciate being here.
It's been lovely having you. Thank you.
It is always a pleasure. So.